Good evening. Thank you so much to everyone who's in the room here with us for coming, and to our online crowd. We're really thrilled that you took the time to tune in and be with us tonight. My name is Rabbi Erica Gerson, and I'll be introducing the evening before passing it off to our esteemed group of panelists. So on behalf of Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, I want to welcome you to this program. I also want to give a shout out to our co-sponsors. We have quite a few. We have the Hindu American Foundation, Californians for Equal Rights, Combat Antisemitism Movement, Chinese American Citizens Alliance of New York, Asian American Coalition for Education, and of course, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I also want to give a special thanks to the Noggin Project, and David Roth is here. It's been a really wonderful partnership that has enabled some of the important work, including some of the people I see in the room, and I'm sure some online who were part of the New Alliances Conference, which was a really exciting initiative that you helped make possible, where we brought together people from a lot of different communities, some of whom we're talking with tonight about exactly what we had intended, which is how do we come together with shared vision for our challenges and our opportunities. Our other major partner tonight, our sponsor, is the Shine a Light Project. So the Shine a Light Project is trying to combat anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism in particular. And they're doing that during Hanukkah by sponsoring all sorts of programming that really shines a light on what is happening. And for those who don't know, I know we have a lot of non-Jews in our audience, which is so wonderful. I want to tell you just a little bit about Hanukkah so that you can understand why does this all make sense. So on one foot, I'll tell you that that this commemorates this is our holiday Hanukkah, which is coming up on Sunday when the sun goes down. And we are commemorating what happened in the 2nd century BCE. And the Maccabees, who you may have heard of, were this small band, this small army that really was thought to have no chance against the Hellenists. But they came together with strong conviction, and they stood up for the right of the Jewish people to maintain our individuality and maintain our practices. So that may sound a little bit familiar to sort of some of our modern struggles. And they ended up winning. We rededicated the temple. And the other part you may know is that there was this miracle with 8 nights of oil. So we had one little jug of oil, and they had the hope and confidence to use that and hoping that it would continue on for 8 nights, which in fact it did. So the way that we commemorate it now, there's 2 main things that happen. We gather in our homes, and when we do that, as I'll be doing with my children, we tell the story. So our children have to know, where do we come from? What are we fighting for? Again, it's for our right to have a particular story, even here in America, in the arc of history, that we can all have our wonderful stories and we can be proud of them. And we light the menorah with one light that continues. This is our shamash, our working candle. And one of the powerful things about fire or oil is that when we light from one to the next, is that it doesn't diminish. It grows the light, and our light can stand, and the light together shines into the darkness. The other part of our commemoration is that we have an instruction. When you look out in New York City, it's really fun because you will hopefully see in quite a few windows, not only the beautiful Christmas trees that are sparkling, but a lot of menorahs, these 8+1, so a 9 candle little lamp. And we do that on purpose. It doesn't just happen to be in the window. That's our obligation. So we take what starts at home as a conversation and a ritual with our children, and we bring it out into the larger community by putting it in our window. We have a mitzvah, a commandment to publicize the miracle and share it with other people. And I think that's really appropriate for what we're talking about tonight, which is you come together in a small group of people who have strong convictions and a sense of purpose and a sense that we can overcome even if we start off smaller, and we can grow by sharing our message and our convictions. And ultimately, we have a responsibility to take that out beyond these smaller conversations and into the world and bring that light even into the darkest of places, and know that we can be agents of change in history, even if we are small, because we're small and mighty. So that's the connection that I see to Hanukkah, and why I think it's so appropriate that we're here together talking about something that is important to all of our communities, the real question that we have for the night, which is, how does this new ideology that some would call wokeism, you'll use other language tonight, the far left ideology, how is it a threat to the Jewish community and to Asian communities as well as other communities? But what do we have in common? What can we learn from it? And what can we take to be stronger together? So with all of that, I am delighted to turn it over to Brandy Shuputinsky, who is the Director of Education and Community Outreach for Jewish Institute of Liberal Values, and she will introduce the rest of our panelists. So thank you again for joining us, and to those who celebrate, happy Hanukkah.
Thanks, Erica. So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited and happy to be here with you all and to be moderating this wonderful panel. I'd like to ask panelists, please come join me and I'll introduce you. So Nathan Klein is a leading pollster of OPM. He recently conducted a study poll with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. It was uncovering the dangers of ideology and the impact that that ideology has in the American Jewish and Asian American communities. Wei Hua Chen. Thank you. Wei was an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and founding president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York. Lizzie Wahab is a very sought after speaker and leader of transnational education and looks at the power of education in building cross-cultural connections. And David Bernstein, the founder and CEO of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and author of the recently released Woke Antisemitism. And Nathan, I believe that you're going to share some of the data that you collect.
Yeah, we've got some of the survey data here for you this evening. I'll be sure to wait until we get the data up on the screen. I always joke when we talk about math, it's nice to have pretty pictures. Otherwise, everyone goes to sleep. So we do have a PowerPoint here. I was privileged to be able to do a national survey approximately late August, I believe, working with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values to explore American trends on some of these ideas. We did do, it was fully national, 1,600 respondents. We conducted it via online panel. It was weighted to reflect the demographics of the voting population here in the United States. We always try to look at voters with these issues because voters are the ones who show up and express their opinions, although it slightly differs from census. But jumping right into it, because I don't want to take too long. Oh, and our margin of error is about 2.5 points. So any number that's 3 points or bigger, different from the number next to it, that's one that matters. Otherwise, it's a tie. Now, this is the only political thing I will show you this evening, simply because we took this in August. It does show nationally. It showed a Republican +3 on what we call the generic ballot, no names. We just said, which party are you voting for? I believe the current count is about 2.8, 2.9%. This is something that we use not just to brag after elections, but to actually make sure that the data is stratified correctly when we look at the demographics, when we look at the ideology breakdown. So it's the reason I wanted to share that with you. This was a very non-political survey. Now, here, I'm going to take this with me. Hopefully that'll work. Since the folks at home are not actually look at me on camera now, I'm going to stand next to this nice TV. These are different terms related to this conversation that we have brought up that we want to test the reaction. As you can see, there's a huge difference in reception to the Democratic Socialists of America, who have a net -22 favorable, unfavorable. This is one of the groups that has generally been seen as having promoted some of the ideologies we're discussing. At the same time, anti-racism as a term is a +35, while critical race theory, which many people describe as anti-racism ideology, is a -13. That's what we call a net 48-point difference. It just goes to show how much language is important when discussing these issues with the populace at large. These are not people who go home and read the academic papers that we do and attend these types of events or stream them online. These are people who maybe hear a story on Facebook from their cousin and they don't necessarily equate critical race theory and anti-racism. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, another term that's used within these conversations, a net +22, so somewhere in between the others. Again, critical race theory, very unpopular. Diversity, equity, inclusion, okay, I'm cool with that. Anti-racism, that's a great idea. I hate racism and I hate racists. I'm an anti-racism person because they're not familiar with the ideology behind each of these terms. Now, we want to look at the breakdown here when you look at the Democratic Socialists of America and the critical race theory because the overall numbers are very similar. And you look at the breakdowns here, this is by ideology at the bottom. So we gave them 6 options. You can describe yourself as progressive, very liberal, somewhat liberal, moderate, somewhat conservative, or very conservative. And you can see that there is a alignment here between the very liberal and the progressive cells, the very liberal and the progressive, the somewhat liberal, not quite in the same place. And you see this sliding scale to the point where very unpopular with moderates on both terms. So there is an ideological slant here, but it's one of the reasons when we look at liberals overall, we include people who self-describe as progressive. They are different on some issues. Now, I'm going to do this one quick. We have a definition of opinion elites. What it basically means, you went to college, you read some national newspaper at least a few times a week. We gave them New York Times, CNN, LA Times, gave them a few examples. And that they are at a managerial level professionally, that there are people who work below them. So that's, just so you know, that's our definition of opinion elites. You don't have to worry about all the numbers on the screen. We're just going to have that as a crosstab, and we want you to know who they are. Now, here's where we started with some of these issues, because there's a lot of overlap from race to gender to religion, all of this stuff. We started with gender fluidity because it gives you an idea of the shape of where this ideology exists. Please tell me what you agree with more, even if neither is exactly right. Some people say gender is fluid. Being a woman is a state of mind or something that you feel inside you, has very little to do with biology. Versus there are 2 genders, men and women. A woman is defined as someone with 2 X chromosomes and born with a female anatomy. And you can see it's 23 to 66, but 23% of America said they agree that gender is fluid. That includes a plurality of progressives, a majority of very liberals. By the time you get to somewhat liberal, they believe gender is a biological definition. Moderates, conservatives, nobody's surprised by that. But you see our opinion elites. Now we split the opinion elites into those who consider themselves Democrats, those who consider themselves Republicans. And you can see among Democrat opinion elites, which are ideologically to the left, 41% say that gender is fluid. That's a huge difference from among Republicans, 18% say so. Again, among the opinion elites, you read the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, you have a managerial position, you've been to college. I'm sure nobody's shocked. There is an age difference. 41% under the age of 30 gets up to 13% among senior citizens. It is actually somewhat flat by race, but you can see among the Hispanic community, we actually got a pop here, which is interesting to me. And we hope to learn more in the future, but not much difference by gender, although it is concentrated in the urban areas. Why is it concentrated in the urban areas? Not because they live in cities, it's because young people live in cities. Democrats are more likely to live in cities, liberal more likely to live in city. It's a function of who they are, not a function of where they are. Now that's just the shape of this electorate that we're thinking about, because we have a high end and a low end for that electorate. Now we get into privilege. This is just for comparison. I thought you guys would be interested. Do these people have too much power in the blue bar, the right amount, or too little? Too much power, mainstream media, Supreme Court, 45%, Senate, 39%, President, 36%, House of Representatives, 35%. About the right amount is your green bar. This is among opinion elites in the circles on the side. Now we get to the interesting ones. So mainstream media, 58%, too much power. U.S. House of Representatives, 35%, too much power, probably because they can't get anything done. It's hard to pretend you have power when nothing passes. Now, I left mainstream media on top for the comparison. What we see next is corporations. 54% say too much power, only 5% too little. The progressive left, 42 to 12. No surprise, there's a difference among the opinion elites based on party. Democrats say 36% say the progressive left has too much power. So a full third of Democrat opinion elites, college educated, I read national news, I have a managerial professional responsibility. A full third of them think the progressive left has too much power. No shock, 2/3 of Republican opinion elites think the same. The conservative right, exact opposite, but you can see this 23% among Republican opinion elites thinking the conservative right has too much power. Lower than that full third among the left, thinking that they're rabble-rousers, right? Think of this, it's the rabble-rousers on the right versus the rabble-rousers on the left. And among the left, they're a little more concerned about it. You look at the LGBTQ community. Yes, there's a partisan difference, but fully a third of Americans saying, yeah, they have too much power, 25 about right, 24 too little. This is actually one of our biggest too little. People of color is our number one at too little. 36% of the country saying people of color have too little power within our communities. And you can see American Jews also down here, 14% too much, 39 not enough, or 39 about right, 18 not enough. And you can see as we get to smaller communities, you get more people refusing to answer the question. That's just pretty typical of surveys. There's Joe Schmo living on his cornfield in Iowa taking a survey. What do you mean Jews have too much power? I don't know any Jews. I'm trying to get the corn in, So as we get to smaller and smaller communities, you get more and more what we call non-response bias, which is fine. We're just looking at ratios. Which of the following groups do you think benefit from privilege? They could check as many as they wanted, so it doesn't add up to 100. Whites, 53%. 78% among Democrats think whites have too much privilege. 32% among Republicans. Number 2, blacks. It's here number 3 with Democrats, benefit from privilege. Number 3 with independents. Number 1 with Republicans. This is messy stuff. Jews comes in number 3, but number 2 among Democrats, 4 with independents, 5 with Republicans. And you can see Asians here also in the top 5, 4, 5, doesn't make the top 5 for Republicans. Obviously, the white number driven by the 78% with Democrats is kind of dominant, but there's a lot of, it's messy. It's messy. We can't lie about this. Conversations about race are messy. They always have been. Muslims didn't really make it into the top with any group. We also looked at this with liberals. You see whites, Jews, LGBTQ, blacks, Asians. Again, Muslim, Latino did not make the top 5 here among the left. Among the right, or excuse me, this is a break. This is the progressives, very liberal, somewhat liberal. This top line is among liberals overall. But you can see white, Jew, LGBTQ, white, Jew, Latino, white, Jew, LGBTQ. That's where they are. Cancel culture. This is a fun one. I'm going to go faster too, I promise. How concerned are you in regards to cancel culture? 60% yes. It's across ideology. This is one that's across ideology. From 52% progressives, yes, it's higher on the right. Who cares? Among the elites, 75 and 85. In the past few years, have you lost a friend, stopped talking to a relative, or grown distant from a colleague because of political opinions or differences? Yes, 34. Among progressives, 2/3 of progressives have lost a friend, family, connection, colleague. And it kind of drops from there. It comes back up at the far right, right? It drops right here in the middle at moderates at 28. You get to very conservative, and they're like, yeah, I piss off people too. Similar. Have you refrained from sharing opinions on political topics? Have you self-censored, essentially, over concern? 45 with progressive, 42 with very conservative. This is, if you're on the extreme wing of the ideology, you kind of know you're on the extreme wing of the ideology. You kind of keep your mouth shut. It's interesting to me that there actually isn't much difference on this. More likely to lose a friend or colleague if you're on the left, but not more likely to self-censor. Conservatives are just as self-censoring as the left. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. These are all positive statements. Our country needs leaders with courage who are focused on fixing society, not tearing it apart. 93% agree. It's kind of hard to disagree with that, right? But we get into some more interesting ones. Children should never be taught that their destiny and inherent value depends on their skin color. 79% agreement. Down here, the messages Americans hear from elite institutions, from the media to academia, is not aligned with the mainstream position on most political issues, 64%. Okay, let's look at this again among our definition of liberals, which is anyone who says progressive, very liberal, or somewhat liberal. Look at the two where we have the most opposition. Not total opposition, they still agree with these statements, but where does it pop? Where does this disagree number pop? 22% disagree. Children should never be taught that their destiny and inherent value depends on their skin color. Down here, the messages Americans hear from elite institutions is not aligned with the mainstream position. 25% disagree. So it's a small segment. It is a quarter of this community. It is not the majority position within this community. Now, here's, well, I don't want to say the scary one, but kind of. and really where we end, which is we slipped this statement, which has a positive framework from a language and grammatical perspective, in among all those other positive statements. So it was kind of hidden to see if people would key in that this was different from the others. That was intentional, because this is what I consider the high end of the challenge of this coalition that believes some of these ideas. America is a structurally racist country in which white Americans and white adjacent groups who emulate white culture, like Asian Americans and Jewish Americans, have unfair advantages over minorities, which must be addressed to achieve equity. And we finish with that, which must be addressed to achieve equity, because I'm sitting here, I've never thought about this stuff before that, so yeah, we got to do something, make it better, right? You click the button, you say, sure, I agree. 45% of America agreed with that statement. Again, we hid it in the survey. We were a little sneaky. 45% and a huge ideological difference. This is where you see the progressive and very liberal number almost exactly the same. Somewhat liberal, 2-to-1, agree, moderates, evenly split. Only about 2/3 of conservatives kind of keyed in negatively on that. Whereas, if you sat down at a bar and had a 30-minute conversation with a conservative around this idea, they'd probably end up rejecting it. As a quick, we got to achieve equity, guys, let's make it better. Fully a quarter of conservatives said, yeah, sure, that sounds good. Again, more urban, younger. Look at this age break. 68% of people under the age of 30 say we're structurally racist and we need to address it to achieve equity. And remember, this says white adjacent groups, not just white groups, white adjacent groups also. 68% of people under the age of 30, only 31% of seniors. You see, there is a huge demographic difference here in terms of race. Not much gender difference, which is interesting to me. A lot of these ideas have big gender differences, which is the last thing I will say. I promise the last. Forget that one. This is interesting. It is a good one. They're all good ones. The start is 60 slides. It's down to 25. I'm already going too long. There's a very similar coalition around issues regarding Israel and Jewishness, which here, working with the Jewish Institute of Liberal Values, we want to ask questions about. Which do you agree with more? Israel is a sovereign nation which has the right and the obligation to defend itself from terrorists intent on killing civilians. Or Israel is an occupier and a colonizer using modern military power to attack defenseless Palestinian civilians to steal more indigenous Palestinian land. We took every online buzzword we could think of in terms of the progressive position and stuffed it in here. And we got 22% saying, yeah, that's it. We got 45% progressive. This is where progressives break with liberals, by the way. A plurality of progressives say occupier and colonizer. A plurality of very and somewhat liberals say, no, they have a right to self-defense. But note, this number, this 22, this is very similar to the gender ideology number we asked at the beginning of the survey. There is a coalition of about 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 people, mostly young, mostly urban. Depending on the issue, there are racial differences, but not on every issue within this ideology, that are buying into this stuff. And you can see among the Dem opinion elites, these are not kids. These are people who have finished college and have managerial professional responsibilities. 1-to-1. More so, 43% agree, 44% agree occupier and colonizer. That's almost as high as the self-described progressives, and it's higher than the very and somewhat liberals among the Democrat opinion elites. This is becoming an elite opinion. They think they have to say it. And that's where I'm going to stop, because thank you. I appreciate you having me here tonight and having the chance to work with you. But there are a lot of other smart folks who I think want to tell you what all of this means. And so I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. So, thank you very much for that information. I'm sure it's going to generate a lot of questions in a little bit. But before we get to the big question, does radical social justice ideology fuel anti-Semitism and anti-Asian sentiment? David, I'd like you to explain what you mean by radical social justice ideology.
Yeah, and even the definitions are controversial. So we're using the term radical social justice ideology here. Sometimes it's referred to as woke ideology, and a lot of times they'll put woke in quotes, signifying that, yes, it's a problematic word, but we can't come up with anything better. Sometimes it's called critical social justice, but no one really knows what that means. Sometimes people say critical race theory, but the problem with that is that critical race theory can actually be a genuine theory. It's not always used in this very ideological sense. So what do we mean by this, whatever this is, radical social justice ideology? What I mean by it are two core tenets. First, that bias and oppression are not just a matter of one's personal attitudes and personal predispositions, but rather are woven into the very fabric and systems and structures of society. That's number one. So when you talk about racism, it's not just you are an individual, as an individual, a racist or a non-racist or an anti-racist, but rather society-wide. It's in the very air that we breathe. That's number one. The second tenet is that only those with lived experience of that oppression and that bias are qualified and have the insight to define it for the rest of society. Now, that second tenet can often be weaponized in a way that tries to stifle discussion, to prevent dissent. It's saying that you're not qualified to have an opinion on this because you haven't experienced any of it, so it's invisible to you. And when you do pretend like you're qualified, you're coming from a place of privilege. And so that's often used in a way, in my view, a mischievous way to stifle any alternative views. Now, I would like to just add that both of these things can be true. In other words, bias and oppression can be part of the very structures of society. I mean, I think we'd be hard pressed to say Jim Crow America was an oppressive state, and it wasn't just a matter of individual attitude. It was very much part and parcel of the culture of America. And we can think of hundreds of others examples of that. And it can be true that people who have experienced discrimination have some real unique insights into it. We should listen to them when they talk. But no one of us can have the final word on the matter. First of all, as a Jewish person, let's say I've experienced anti-Semitism, but there are other Jewish people who have very different experiences than me. And they may even contest my narrative about what anti-Semitism is. The other thing about it is that there might be other data points that might point in a different direction. So even though I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism, and if you just believe me, you might think everything, anti-Semitism is everywhere, then you would read the Pew survey that came out a few years ago, which suggested that Jews were the most admired religious community in America. So again, that's another data point. And we have to be able to factor all these things. That's why an open liberal conversation, and by liberal, another term we should probably define, free expression of ideas and the rule of law and the like. That's what I mean in this context by liberal. That kind of societal infrastructure, that operating system in society is so important because it allows us to listen to people's individual experience and also other data points. And that's what we're being deprived of in the current ideological moment.
Thank you. So, Layla, I want to know if you have some insight into David's definition and also into whether you think this ideology impacts the Asian American community in a negative way.
I'd like to, before I begin to discuss my comments here, to acknowledge the land on which we are now holding this meeting. I want to thank the oysters that were here, that are now gone from Manhattan, but remains with us on Pearl Street. There is also the cherry tree that was chopped off by General Washington when he was much, much younger on Cherry Street, that remains. And then there are all the beavers that have since disappeared from New York, but Beaver Street still remains. So fortunately, we have many things that we still must acknowledge. And why is this important? Not just for the comedic effect. When we hear it happening, it shows where this kind of radical theory comes from. They want to make it into a religion. They want to make it a cult. Because when you're doing that, you're offering a prayer. You're making people also pledge. When you come down and you say, you must act in a certain way, you are depriving the individuals of their thought, their ability to rationalize, to reason, to conduct inquiry, to ask facts. And that connects to what you're saying, David, in the liberal mind. The liberal mind has to be one that is open to inquiry, accepting, acknowledging facts more than anything else. When you talk about this lived experience, that should not be the center of the universe. Your lived experience is not the center of the universe. It is not the definition of facts. It is how we relate to everybody, connecting with everybody, that is important. And that is where we have to start and figure out what is this that's going on. And don't just think that these are harmless little gestures that are happening. These are not harmless little gestures. When they teach in schools that you have to do these acknowledgments and pledges, and even to the extent in California where they were teaching their kids to have an Aztec, I believe it was an Aztec chant. And you have to remember that these are people who are cannibals, okay? So we have to push back with reason, because that is where we connect with people in harmony, and not to judge people collectively, because that is a collective judgment that is happening, and we must defend against collective judgment, because that dehumanizes everybody in this room. So that's where we stand from and saying, how does it connect us with anti-Semitism, with also all the problems that are happening in against the Asians? We could talk about systemic racism really happening when it is happening in the schools, where we are getting this kind of indoctrination. It's not just the indoctrination that they're doing to us, but they are also barring our children, whether they are Jews or Asians, from the top elementary schools, in the gifted and talented programs, in the middle schools, in the screen programs, in the high schools, where they're exam schools, because there are standards, and we want to make sure that kids of any color can meet those standards. If they can't meet the standards, they don't want to try to go and fix it and have the kids study better at the earlier ages and be prepared. No, what they want to do is get rid of the standards. That doesn't help anybody in the world. And then to add insult to injury, to get to the universities, where Asians are told they have no courage, no personality. And they look at all sorts of odd ways to take out the Asian from the equations, so that we are now proceeding at the Supreme Court on an affirmative action case, a racial preference case against Harvard. This is the Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard and UNC. These are very important moments for all of us, not just for Asians, but for all people. Because as Edward Bloom would tell you, who's the head of SFFA on the Harvard case, he saw this happening directly to the Jews. That's why he worked so hard, because what happened to the Jews was wrong then, and what's happening to the Asians now is completely wrong too. And in that, we must make sure that it does not happen to anybody else, whether they are Asian, Jewish, or Black, or brown, or any color. Thank you.
Hey, that was a powerful moment to follow. Thank you, Dr. Wei, for thank you, Dr. Wei, for that very important description of what we are all experiencing at this moment. I wrote down my speech because when I get nervous, I change into Bengali, my native tongue. So to spare you that lost in translation part, if you would please indulge me. I come from the higher education sector. I am a vice president for enrollment, financial aid, and student life. I've spent 23 years of my career helping demographics into institutions to change not only their margin, but the way they operate. My last big assignment was at the university, at State University of New York in Plattsburgh. Before that, the State Institute in Maine. If any of you saw those big billboards that said "Go to UMaine for the cost of UConn and Rutgers," that was my marketing campaign to bring back demographics back into the state of Maine. After the campaign took off beautifully, and we moved from 12,000 students to 29,000 as a system, presidents whispered that a woman, especially an Asian woman, shouldn't be leading such campaigns. So, as it has happened many times in my career, the accolades, the collective accolades go to my men counterparts, even though I have done this over and over again for 6 institutions. So it's pretty much the story of my life, but from every institution I've learned the ability to dance around what we call wokeism. As a 5'1" Bengali, and to essentially get as many students the opportunity to get a state supported education, balancing financial aid and the student's ability to achieve. So my war in terms of higher education is to continue to change the platform one student at a time, one financial aid package at a time, and to hit that critical mass. Then that can release the halo effect. So I wrote some of those thoughts down, but it's a general answer to the question we are asking here. Again, so I'm gonna just read the transcript. Almost every field of human endeavor in our society is feeling this effect of a top-down imposition of what we are referring today as radical social justice. In my own field of college education and training, younger faculty, without their consent, are being required to pledge their fealty to this manufactured consensus, both from within their academic disciplines and as general members of the collegiate community. Many senior colleagues of mine raised in the 20th century paradigm of higher education experience this current transformation as disruptive and destructive of the historical values that govern their research and their search for truth. As the newest member of the academic community, today's students are seeking credentials for future jobs, but are thoroughly confused and looking for leadership in our generation. What brings us here today is the reality that this ideology imposition is not benign, but contains within it the new justification for oppression of nearly all of us who are not currently members of the new priestly class. Simply put, radical social justice ideology is a distillation of envy, jealousy, tribalism, and blatant prejudice in which individuals become nothing more than avatars of a monolithic ethnic, racial, and religious blobs that are ranked ordered in their sinfulness, deserving of any and all punishment that can be dashed out to them. As such, radical social justice ideology is anti-human rights, and by extension, gives the green light for expression of all form of anti-Semitism and anti-Asian sentiment, among other targets, for a cruel delight of its eager adherents. In my field, this inhumane ideology incentivizes the division of people by race, ethnicity, and the ability to use our circumstances to rise out of poverty, with our minds and our means. Most of my career has been spent in the instinctive opposition of such racist policies. I help students one at a time manage their time at the universities through aid of persistent grants and scholarships. Where universities who are seeking margins by churning out high credit, high debt, and no degree students, my team and I work to readmit them so they get a second chance and a financial and education mobility to better their life. The good work we do in the university administration is stymied by this racial ideology that pits our students against each other. Activists in our universities are policing higher education communities and directing attacks not only on our students, but the student government, the older generations of professors, and our freedom to choose to make our lives better regardless of creed, family status, and background. Let me share with you some anecdotes from my time in higher education. In my leadership roles at state universities, I witnessed this radical ideology take over, orchestrating much of what we call the campus student experience through programming designed by young, inexperienced hall directors who then would challenge the equity of programming and to the broader division of student life and agencies on campus by inducing social justice revolution. In seeking to impact campus culture, presidents and senior leadership have buckled and are preventing any analysis of such resident life bylaws in evaluating campus bureaucracies, like incident bias response team. Universities are being asked by system CDOs, which are the chief diversity officers, to hold large numbers of social justice events sponsored by various administrative branches, like the Office of Equity, Diversity, the Office of Multicultural Affairs. The sheer number of these events show the move away from standards and curriculum meetings, move away from what we need to do to make sure our students are positioned to graduate and their first entry-level job. All these meetings must be weighed against the number of nonpartisan events that are held on campus. Nowadays, they're few to none. These events and the programs they are embedded within give a sense of variety of ways that students are subjected to an atmosphere of indoctrination and social justice agenda. As history has shown over and over again, colleagues, through generations and eons, such radical ideology has been the means through which power is acquired, through the plight of the most vulnerable, and then unleashed cruelly on the most vulnerable. When evil comes to our community, to our families, to our children, it will wear the clothes of righteousness, pretending to advocate for the justice we all seek. But you and I, we all know the true intent of such evil is their treatment of others. A true love of justice is born out of a heart of love and the spirit and sees all humanity with the wonderful diversity as belonging to a single family. A true heart would never delight in dominating and destroying others, in sowing division for its own sake, regardless of its ideological trappings. In fighting such a radical movement, a true heart must defend free speech and the freedom of choice in higher education and beyond, so that the common good is truly served. When higher education undermines the common good with its embrace of radical social justice ideology, the legislators and leadership must come and defend of the students, who are the most vulnerable to this politicization of higher education in America today, under the pretense of social justice. I hope each and every one of us today leaves here with a desire to humanize higher education instead of politicizing it. This is a long battle that we all share for our common good and our shared future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lizzie. When I think about the threat that radical social justice has to all communities, but for the case of tonight, looking specifically at the American Jewish and Asian American communities, there are two things that really concern me. It's the stifling of free speech through either compelled speech or self-censorship. And it's also I guess it's kind of adjacent to that, the discouraging of questioning. And I think about how that then impacts American Jewish community and the Asian American community, and I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I'm going to answer that, but I didn't really talk about the connection between this ideology and anti-Semitism. And if you wouldn't mind, I'll just take a second to do that. So, and not just anti-Semitism, but anti-Asian sentiment. I think there are really three ways that this ideology affects both of our communities. Probably more than three ways, but I'm going to talk about three ways. One is it explicitly discriminates against us. In the concept of equity, which was coined and popularized by Ibram X. Kendi, the idea is that any group that is not perfectly represented in an institution, in other words, according to its proportionate population, by definition is a victim of racism or discrimination. By definition, in other words, the only acceptable explanation for that disparity is oppression. By the same token, any group that is quote unquote overrepresented, and I think you can easily read in Jews and Asians, are complicit in that oppression. They have to be, because how else will they have gotten to their station? And I think that while this is in its relative infancy, we're still seeing equity sort of move through our systems and our institutions. That's going to have severe consequences down the line. And we're already starting to see equity in action in ways that are going to profoundly affect our communities. At one point, about a third of the Yale student body was Jewish. I don't know exactly what the numbers are now. Just imagine how a reshuffling based on non-academic factors are going to affect ultimately Jews who want to attain higher education. So I think we're going to see huge effects in that way. And I think that's where Jews and Asians have a lot in common. Second, it breeds resentment. Whenever you attach identity to privilege, automatically, in other words, because you're Jewish or because you're white or because you're any group, you automatically have privilege. That's going to spell serious problems for groups that are perceived on average as being more privileged. But the key is on average. It may be that there are Jews who grew up in a state of privilege. There are, of course, and there are Asians as well, and there are Black Americans and white Americans and women, and all groups can grow up in a state of privilege. But to automatically attach privilege to that identity is a way of basically characterizing all people in that group. It's a stereotype of all groups, and it's not only going to be weaponized, and it is being weaponized against our communities in a way, and that's why you're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Asian sentiment on the progressive left that was evident in the data that Nathan showed. You're also going to see sort of a response from people who are viewed as the oppressor class, who don't feel like they're oppressors at all. You can imagine if you're a poor white person in a manufacturing town and you're being told that you're privileged because of your skin color, you're going to react negatively to that. And that's breeding a politics of resentment on the right as well that I think we have to watch out for. A third way that this really affects us is it's almost an assault on the immigrant experience that we bring to this country. Now, I'm not an immigrant. My mother's an immigrant. Many Jews who are second, third, fourth generation still derive their identity from that immigrant experience. And many Asians are immigrants or second generation. Immigrants largely came to this country seeking greener pastures. And you know what? There are greener pastures in this country. There are greener pastures. I can tell you from, my mom would tell you, coming from Baghdad, Iraq, that there are greener pastures in the United States. Any Jew from the former Soviet Union who lives here now and has made a life here will tell you that these are greener pastures. And I know many Chinese Americans will tell you that these are greener pastures. And I know many others will tell you the same. And yet they're being told that America is pervasively oppressive. And it starts to feel to them that the country they fled to is sounding like the country they fled from. And it is profoundly disorienting for many immigrants and their kids who came here for a purpose to seek democracy and liberty and openness and so forth. And that's being taken away from them. That's fundamentally affects who we are as people. And I think in some ways, this is not just an external threat, it's being internalized by our kids and so forth. I grew up around a Shabbat table in which we would debate issues. And I did that with my children as well. But now my kids are getting the message that it's not okay to debate issues, that there's one answer, that they should learn, in the words of my child's anti-racist audit in their school system, to recognize and resist systems of oppression. So we're conditioning not just the broader society to understand precisely who's oppressed and who the oppressors are based on their identities, but we're conditioning them to think in very binary terms. And I think that's a tragedy. And it's not just a tragedy because we're going to be negatively affected by the external world, but because we're going to be negatively affected in how our kids come to think of themselves.
What David talked about over here, as well as Lizzie, on the assault on merit, the standards, it's compelling because they're trying to get an outcome. And so language matters. What we were saying about equity, everybody says, this sounds so cool, so nice. Nathan said it, people are cool with it, but it doesn't mean equity. It means something completely different. It means I have my piece and I want your piece too. It's no longer about what really is equitable, but they want to lull you into thinking about that. It's basically an immoral condition. And if we want to go and talk about the Golden Rule, to talk about Confucianism, we start off by saying, you should not do to others what you do not want others to do to you. You do not do to others. Okay? That kind of bad type of action. But what this whole immoral ideology would say is that we're going to judge people as a group. As a group. Collective judgment is a horrible thing. That's right, the guilt by association, and it's a guilt before you're even given a chance to prove that you're innocent, in fact, right? You're guilty before trial. You've been convicted just by your race, and or the oppressor. Sometimes they'll extend it because it's not just race, it goes to other things. We're here talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Asian issues, but this is a little bit bigger than that, and we won't go into all of that. But a lot of the words, the terminology, you could Google that, find it pretty easily before they shut it down. But those are things that we have to be concerned about, and saying that you have to push back and say, what is it that's happening? And it goes from the schoolroom onto the streets. When your schools tell you that it is okay to discriminate against a people from the school, exclude them. This is DEI, right? DIE, right? We're going to talk about exclusion. This is what it's about. It's not equity. The E stands for exclusion. So when you start excluding Jews from the top schools, and Asians from the top schools. And it trickles down, as I said, it's not just in the universities. It's not just Harvard. It's all of these schools. It goes, yeah, it goes very, very wide. And it happens in the STEM schools too, because a lot of the STEM schools, you would have thought that STEM would be immune to this. It is not. When even in medicine, they're going to say, we're going to have a certain number of doctors of a certain profile. This is the collective judgment point, regardless of whether they are the best person for that job or not. And so that imposes a huge, huge danger on the entire community. Lives are at stake. When you talk about your doctors, your pilots, United Airlines is saying that. United Airlines wants to say that our goal is to have 50% of our pilots be women and people of color. How about having 100% of your pilots being the best pilots possible to get you safely up and down from the air? These are the real lives at stake. But for the kind of institutionalized racism now, starting from the schools and to jobs, all the corporations are doing this now. That sends a very big signal when they say too many Jews, too many Asians. And then you hear those very terms on the street when they slug an Asian for no good reason. They're not even asking for money. This is not a transaction. They're not saying, I want your money or your life. They're slugging you because you belong somewhere else. It happened in the city council just last week. Okay, New York City Council. When somebody said of the Asians who spoke before on a hearing on criminal checks for rentals, and one of the people said that, well, those are all Asians talking, and they don't belong here. They belong in China and Hong Kong, and they're all that kind of dialogue. It is the same thing. What is worse is the city council members did not say a thing, but gave extra time to this person who is spouting hateful speech, gave extra time and thanked him. So it's one thing for a private individual to say certain things, but when our elected officials allow that to happen, that says to the people on the street, it's open season, it's okay. And that extends to other parts of the critical theory of this radical social justice that says no consequences for bad behavior, merit. We cannot make that kind of differentiation. We want to let them out because we have the representational numbers. Things are not perfectly representational. So what we have to do is free everybody to be able to commit more crimes. These are very rational people. So this is the kind of connect from our very institutions all the way down to our streets that affects every one of us.
So I want to ask you, what do you do when there are two points and threads that I got from what you were saying? One, the normalization of hate and bigotry, where it's becoming normalized. And two, the unquestioning of the hypocrisy. And the example that you gave, David, was the immigrant experience, where you have people that have come and their parents, grandparents came to this country for greener pastures. And that same group that is kind of demonizing or weaponizing the identity of that group of people is then also taking the complete opposite stance on what some people call the migrant crisis on the southern border. So how do you reconcile those two things, the hypocrisy and then the normalization of bigotry?
I'll take a little bit of this, Dr. Wei, because what you're touching on is something that I've kind of battled with for a long time in my career. I've been called white adjacent. Looking at my color, wouldn't you say I'm more black adjacent? But so I've always had a hard time. And finally, one of the Sunni CDOs explained to me that it is not my color, but my behavior, which people are referring to as white adjacent. Coming from Bangladesh, I am acutely aware of privileges and people who take that too far, acutely aware of it from childhood. As a woman, a girl born into a conservative Muslim family, you can't help but know that, your destination is pre-planned as a part of a familial trajectory and history. And to break out of that, it's like an act of God. It's truly, I sympathize with the Israelites coming out of Egypt because I've felt that in Bangladesh often. Yet, my love for my country, my family, is unsurpassed. The immigrant experience is a hard experience because to gain that greener pasture, you give up so much that you never reconcile that until you die. Many of our ancestors want to be flown back to their country of birth when they die because they feel at least, perhaps at the end, I'll rest in a place I know and hear language I am familiar with. Even now when I get off the plane, I sigh in Bangladesh because I'm like, all of a sudden, I don't have to translate anymore. It's a sense of freedom and sense of accomplishment like no other. What I've seen, Brandy, that you point us is we've become complacent in our privilege, whatever that privilege looks like. And we have become too kind and too generous to allow others to come and define for us how we should bring up our children. And as a mother and a mama bear, that is not an area I am willing to give, which means the only weapon I have to fight against this ideology that will first come for me, then the Jews, and then the white people, because it's coming. It's a voracious appetite. It cannot be satiated until we're all done in. I make sure the students that cross my path have the kind of education they need to be able to tell the difference, the kind of first job they need to be able to dissent, that in time they are the privileged that we have to face day in and day out. For each school, critical mass is very important for me. I don't want to increase enrollment by 100 people. I want to increase enrollment by thousands so that if not 1/3, some portion of those people that I've had an opportunity to shape their financial aid becomes that power and privilege so that they can dissent without prejudice. That is my way. And that's the way I find I can make a difference. And I'm sure each one of you have your own way where you can make sure that that hatred does not cross the threshold of your home and your responsibility. Because ultimately, we are responsible for each of our children that we release to this world.
Could I take a quick second? I just want to say very quickly on privilege. A Black woman said, and I don't know who she is actually, but she said, of course there are people who are privileged. And she also said, we're privileged. Everyone here has some privilege to be able to be standing here, to be able to be sitting here. We have some privilege. And so don't weaponize privilege because even the quote unquote privileged has rights. And we should guard the rights even of those with privilege, just as we would guard the rights of those who have fewer privileges. We are not at the French Revolution, and we should never be at the French Revolution.
Yeah, I like how both of you turn the idea of privilege on its head. In other words, it's not some unmitigated evil to have been given an opportunity. In Bangladesh, you had privilege to be able to move out of that destination that was set up for you. And why wouldn't we want that? In other words, why shouldn't we want those opportunities? So I think that it's really in this kind of very fixed vocabulary that is being posed upon us where we lose all subtlety, where we lose the ability to have rich conversations like the one we're having today. I hope we have some time to hear from the audience.
Yeah, we can, please.
I-
If you can, thank you.
I'm sitting here and listening with the third ear, so to speak. I'm sitting here listening with the third ear, as we say in psychology, and framing everything that you're saying in my experience with the women's liberation movement. That's about, well, go back 50 years, when we were considered outrageous and every bad thing. And there was a period in that movement when we had to be outrageous in order to get attention, in order to shake things up, in order to, we counted how many men, how many women, and it was very important at that time. I remember, there were good men who wanted to help us. And we said, no, don't help us. Go form your own men's liberation groups. I had a friend who was a professor, and she didn't let men speak, ask questions, because mostly men were raising their hands and speaking, and she wanted to give the women the experience of speaking up. I think, I don't have a question, I'm sorry. I was just trying to hear what you're saying. When I think of the immigrant experience, and I'm first generation, Blacks who came here didn't come as immigrants. They came as slaves. So what do we do about that?
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all. Maybe later. And I hear everything.
Thanks. So I wanted to say, I know you said you had a hard time framing the question. I want to congratulate you. I think the framing is perfect. And it really gets to an issue that struck me, a formulation that struck me for the first time many years ago when I was at a protest chanting "No justice, no peace." And I stopped in the middle of a chant and I realized that's completely backwards. Okay? If you want peace, peace can only come when people relinquish their claims on past grievances and accept that past injustice is past and try to move forward. When you get into a society focused on justice, you necessarily, a society focused on justice is always a society of war, which is one of the reasons that many cultures recognize true justice lies only with God. If we're focused on justice in this country, we have to have intergroup tension because everybody is focused on their own grievance. And the reason that you get anti-Semitism and anti-Asian attacks specifically is not because anybody thinks that those are the groups primarily to blame, but because those are the groups who have grabbed the outsider seats. The power structure in this country used to be, before we called it white, we called it WASP. And every seat in that power structure currently occupied by a Jew or an Asian was an outsider seat that was opened up. And you've got groups that thought they should be their seats, and the Jews and Asians have crowded them out. So as long as we have a justice-focused society, we have to have anti-Semitism, we have to have anti-Asian discrimination. And it's also, it's completely anti-American because justice was never the bellwether of America. America was about liberty. There are a lot of virtues out there. You have to pick one to frame. The American system was a liberty system. We're currently trying to transition into a justice system, and it will be bloody. And I was wondering if any of you had thought about that type of formulation, how I turn it into a question at the end.
Maybe we should take one more and we'll respond to them both.
Hi, thank you. First of all, thank you everybody here for what your piece of this puzzle, and David, especially for the book, because I did get to read the introduction and the last 3 chapters, because I'm at the point, like everything, you know, and when you summarize in your introduction, I went, yep, and it's all recognizable. I'm from that classical liberal middle that gets squeezed and has gotten squeezed into, well, it hurts sometimes. And then I was, looking at like, what do we do next? So I thank everybody and all your comments, they're wonderful. My particular priority right now is in trying to change the narrative between American Jews and Israel, because there's some really, really bad stuff going on among the same people who we're talking about with the woke ideology, and how they are literally poisoning the well against our ability to stand up vocally and support Israel. So, and just to add a layer to this, I tend to look at this problem from a psychological viewpoint. Dr. Wade.
No, it's Waymont Chen.
Oh, Waymont Chen, sorry, I'm terrible. You brought up that, we have to talk facts, we have to get people to understand reason. And of course, the famous, mantra, facts don't care about your feelings, that. But then, Ben Shapiro, but one of his colleagues recently said, kind of spinning this intellectually, he said, the problem is that for so many of, especially these people, and also people on the other side, their feelings do not care about the facts. And so that's why we have to start looking at this from a psychological perspective to see how we can get people to, a lot of it's fear. It's fear of social isolation if you don't go along with the crowd. It's this crazy binary, you're either good or you're evil, depending on which side you're on. And those of us who are trying to, work in the middle and have those conversations, it's very hard. We have a few people that we are having those conversations with, but then a lot of people in my real life, they cut you off, they don't want to hear it. So what do you, just wondering what you think about that issue of psychological, trying to change that psychology.
David, I'm going to say one thing quickly. When we talk about how to address this ideology and how and to lessen its negative impact on different communities, we have to acknowledge that it breeds because of 2 things, ignorance and silence. So the first thing is education to combat the ignorance. And the second part is to have more conversation, discussion, and debate so that people aren't self-censoring or being forced into compelled speech where they are just, doing like you said, okay, I have to say this, otherwise I'm going to be ostracized.
And community of practice. I feel comfortable enough in this community of Abraham Accords to be able to speak up and feel like I have brothers and sisters who are going to support, even if they don't completely agree with me, support my thought process. And that finding that space, I think, is very, very important. Knowing people are there to support you, that you can pick up the phone and have a conversation is important.
So I think that you raised a really important issue. How do we talk about this so that people with strong feelings are able to hear us? And the answer is, I don't think we know yet. I think we've learned a little bit from the survey that On Message did for us, and we tested out some messages. But we still have to do more market research. We have to talk to groups and try to find out what works. Let me give you an example of how, by going into the marketplace, I'm learning how to frame the issue. If I came to a group of college students and said, I want to do a seminar on quote unquote woke anti-Semitism, which is the title of my book, provocatively titled, I think I'd probably have a lot of doors shut in my face. However, when I talk about ideologically inspired anti-Semitism, and I start with talking about how right-wing ideologies can fuel anti-Semitism, and I can, such as replacement theory on the far right, and then I also talk about how radical Islamist ideology can create anti-Semitism, then I can ease our way into a conversation on how radical social justice ideology also can fuel anti-Semitism. So again, that's through practice and engagement that I'm learning as we go along, but I probably alienated too many people over time in talking in ways that I just didn't know any better. So I think you're right to flag that. And I think this nascent movement of ours needs to do a little bit more framing. We can be unwaveringly intellectually honest and authentic and still figure out the words that work. I really liked how you framed the justice versus liberty. I think we are moving from one paradigm that has largely served this country well to a very different paradigm, and people don't even understand that it's happening. And we have to equip them with the arguments and the words that work to help them understand the world better and understand what they're giving up in the process, because I don't think they know.
Yeah, if I could add quickly, just with regard to the issue of how you get through to folks, one of the things that we didn't have time for from the survey is we asked, where do you think anti-Semitism is coming from? Fun fact, everybody on the left said it comes from the right, everybody on the right said it comes from the left. It's a bit of a summation, but I'm sure nobody's shocked by that. But the point is that I just want to highlight that we live within a broader ideological and political conversation that this ideology is one piece of, to at times an overwhelming extent. At times the emotions, the feelings regarding Donald Trump, for example, are going to overwhelm any sense of logic. And it's one of the reasons I was so excited to support this project, because I do think it's important to have voices within each house, within each vertical, speaking to their like-minded friends in a rational way about this. Because it's not necessarily something where, if Joe Biden gives a great speech, all the Republicans are going to get it. Or if Donald Trump sends a magical tweet that all the Democrats are going to wake up and say, oh yeah, I'm going to change my ways. This is a reality of the world we live in, which is why it's important to build alliances where people can speak from within their own ideological home to other people who are in that home. That was one of the bigger findings here, and I tried to go as fast as I can. So I just wanted to add that to what we discussed earlier.
Please.
Yes. Okay.
Here you go.
So one of the most frustrating things about this moment that we're in for me is the fact that so many people who call themselves social justice oriented are doing things that actually hurt the communities that they most want to help. And, one of the things is I think all of us, can't speak for everyone, but I would imagine all of us agree that, there have been many instances in our history that have been outrageous and unfair, and we need to address those, and that equity is an important goal. But we're not getting there through, viewing groups that were the oppressed as now the oppressors. That's not going to get us there. So one of the things that's most frustrating for me is the lack of addressing the failures of our public education system. That, we have, Black children are failing at enormous rates throughout the country, they're not reading, writing, or doing math at grade level at astonishingly low numbers. But you cannot get anyone who is a social justice ideologue to take on the teachers' unions, for example. Another thing that we saw in the police defund movement, we had to deal with all of the police defunding and communities that were hurt the most by that were the communities that need good policing and effective policing. So I think what's so frustrating for me at this moment is that, the things that we want to see happen and change for the positive are not getting done by the people who have very misguided ideas about how to get there. And I see it every single day, as recently as the city council hearing, which I was at, that was a very frustrating example of how when you deprive small landlords of criminal background checks, the buildings that don't have doormen, the buildings that don't have security, they're the buildings that are going to be, people living in those buildings are going to be hurt the most. So it's an observation. Thank you. Oh,
I totally agree with your points, Maria. And I think one of the things that we can do to be a little more positive and constructive here is that by building these alliances, which I saw really happening in such an exciting way at the New Alliances Conference last spring, we can help take what can be a small voice within a community, and by coming together, make a larger impact, because we can be a large coalition together behind those smart voices that may either not be the majority opinion within a particular group, or may be perceived as not a significant opinion, but that's actually not true. So an example I think of is I went to a march with Harlem Mothers Save and Jackie Rowe, who was representing families who have lost their children to gun violence. It was African Americans in Harlem who were saying, in the midst of the height of the defund the police movement, we want police. Enough of Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. And it was astonishing. And by having more people and broader coalitions come together, we allow the media to come in and say, this is a story. So I did see, maybe it's because we get these filtered feeds, but I did see the story about city council. I think other people in the room did. And when we come together and show solidarity with one another, it's just that many more voices that hopefully can get things onto camera. And just one last thought, and it connects to what a couple of you were saying, Brandy and Wewa, that this, you had such a great word, and I couldn't remember the phrase you said, but basically a forced perception of agreement across, across a divide. It was I don't remember exactly what you said, but basically, consensus by what?
It's consensus.
Right, consensus, exactly. And that just rung so true for me. And when I think about my own experience and my children's experience in school, it's really powerful to be able to break that down and say, if you are the first to open your mouth, someone else will open their mouth too. And it happens. And one way we've done that, when we had a book party for Woke Antisemitism, the number of people, including the young people, the high schoolers who were there, who said, it is so refreshing and empowering just to know there's other people besides the people at my own dinner table who think this way. Several of the teenagers said that. I said, it's not just my parents. That was exciting for them and empowering for them. And I would just encourage everyone who's tuning in and everyone who's here tonight to think about what small internal conversations can you start, and where externally can you have a conversation that allows people to realize that it's not consensus.
Thank you. Let's see if anyone has any other questions. Yes.
My question is about the leadership. So my first question would be, who started all this? What's the genesis of this entire radical social justice ideology? That's number one. Number two, we have some great leaders in this country. I happen to be from Brooklyn, and I grew up in the 50s in Brooklyn when it was post-war. And basically, we mainly had Jewish communities in Brooklyn. So when we talk about Jewish white privilege, what does Schumer have to say? He grew up at Madison High School a couple of years after I did. What did Justice Ginsburg have to say about her white privilege? She studied very hard at Madison High School a few years before I graduated from Madison High School. How about Bernie Sanders? He went to Madison High School. Does he say anything about his white privilege? I haven't heard a thing about it. A couple of days ago, Janet Yellen talked about graduating from Hamilton High School in Brooklyn. Has she spoken about her white privilege? So tell me about this. What about this? Why aren't they speaking out if this is such a big movement And basically, these are mostly, I would call Bernie Sanders, Chuck Schumer, quite liberal, but I haven't heard a word from them.
So let me just try to hit those questions. First of all, this ideology really took shape in the late 1960s, and what one person coined the long march through institutions. It sort of took the Marxist frame and substituted culture for class, and viewed society in a binary, in a similar way that Marxism did with the bourgeoisie, and started to look at it through this prism of culture, and certain cultures being given privilege and other cultures being fundamentally oppressed. And that gained ground in certain universities, particularly in California, and then sort of spread in the university system. And in the last 20 years or so, started to sort of escape the confines of campus into the larger society. And we've seen that especially in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, where many of these ideas that were once sort of in certain campuses and probably just in the humanities programs are now becoming a dominant discourse. So that's how it's taken shape. And many of the people that you're mentioning are probably people who are critical of this ideology, but also want to make common cause with progressives in their own camp. Chuck Schumer, for example, wants to make sure that he doesn't alienate the progressive wing of the party, and he's going to try to do everything he can not to call it out. So there's a political logic, unfortunately, that makes it hard for people in the Democratic Party to call out their own left flank. I don't personally believe that this is where the ideology that animates Bernie Sanders. I think he's much more of a class-oriented ideologue, but he's not going to, again, cut that part of his base. In terms of
So there's a dearth of brave people.
there's a dearth of brave people. Our job, the people in this room, the people watching, is to bring others out of the woodwork. That's what we have to do, because we're the majority. There's a rational majority, and we're being underrepresented in the discourse. I think it is absolutely true that this ideology produces terrible social outcomes. I think it is in stifling conversation and inquiry, you don't actually get to what the real problems are. So you don't actually spend time and effort in lifting people up. You end up just debating, equity in the here and now. So if you're just debating equity in the here and now, and you say, okay, equity requires us to have 13% Black scientists, it becomes an excuse not to invest in young minds, young kids who really could be scientists. You're not doing anything to equip them with the education that they would need to become scientists in the future. And that's really a tragedy, in my view. And Erica, one more time, what was your?
I'd like to say that on a positive note here, that many of us face, courage is contagious.
Yeah.
And then standing up there, having one person speak, another person speak, and we should be thinking about these and engaging with the people who disagree with us, because they disagree with us, and some of them are frankly deluded. And so, because think about it, this kind of critical theory, if I were, and I'm not, a psychologist or psychoanalyst, and I would say, we're going to think of you as either a victim or oppressor. And I'm just thinking, who in their right mind would say that that's a good thing for a person to be thinking about? You don't want to be either a victim or an oppressor, and to think your whole life that way. The entire society is being gaslit to be thinking of them as sick people. And, I think we want to make sure that our people aren't sick and stop them from thinking this. It's as simple as that. But I'm sorry, you had another comment there?
I just wanted to add just the best resource on the issue of where does this come from. I recommend going on to James Lindsay's new Discourses website, his locals, I mean, he has done I've learned so much listening to his podcasts on where this all comes from, how it's infiltrated the first higher education, now how it's infiltrating, everything from preschool to 12, and who's doing it, who's responsible, and how. And he is someone. He's not Jewish. He's not Asian. But he is like, he's sort of what the Brits would call a mad lad, because he's out there, and one of his strategies is he loves to talk to mothers groups.
Yeah. These were mama bears.
Yes. So he
Domestic
has found,
terrorists.
that's right. Exactly.
Come for my child. Oh yeah, terrorism is in the menu.
So that's exactly, that. And the other person is Christopher Rufo, who he's from the Manhattan Institute, his affiliation. He's got a new YouTube channel where he also does similar deep dives. Between the two of them, I find that the explanation is like really graspable by ordinary people.
Right. The message has to be simple. I think that's one of the things, is that we have to think about it in terms of, how does this really hurt? And sometimes it is as simple as, this is not really ethical if you're going to treat people in that manner. And so stop, would you want this to be done to you? And the answer is no. And so if you don't think that this should be done to you, don't do it to others. And where does it start from? It starts a lot nowadays from the education schools. If you look at all the education schools and what they're teaching their teachers to go into from pre-K all the way to 12, and then let it beyond from the universities, when they can actually go to a elementary school and tell the kids, we're going to separate you into different classes, and you're going to say, what's your privilege? And so some kids are coming home and thinking that, and it happens to Asians also. It's not just white kids, and I don't know whether it's happening a lot for the Jews, but we have actually heard of cases where the kids have gone back home very upset that they have been told that they're privileged because they happen to be Asian or white, and put into a certain side. This is, I would say that it is actually damaging, and you could call it psychological abuse, child abuse. Maybe we should be thinking about that.
At the highest extent, let's call it what it is. I think, like, as scientists, we know that we must state a problem. A statement of problem is very important. And we are so used to giving people the pass. I'm at a point in higher education, I'm not willing to give them a pass anymore. This is the problem, and this is my statement, this is my hypothesis, prove me wrong. And it's just, great darkness has to be only shed by great light, right? So we've got to come in numbers. We've got to be present. We've got to make sure that when a school board decides that we vote every single one of them out. That's the privilege of democracy.
On that lovely note, I want to thank all of our panelists, our co-sponsors, everyone who came in person, everyone who's attending virtually, but for the sake of time, we have to close. But I love what you said. The idea of shining a light on what's actually happening is first step in doing that together. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.